Vijayalakshmi, Suresh also. Yeah. Sunil Kumar first. So, Vijayalakshmi, Suresh. And Mr. MP Vijayakumar. You can take that. That's it. So already yesterday there was a lot of discussion about three lines of defense and all that, but actually we have a very interesting set of questions. Before that, I have the honor of introducing our speakers in a little more detail. So first to start off with Ms. Vijayalakshmi Suresh. She's a BCom ACA, a finance professional with over 30 years of experience in Tata Group, specifically Voltas and Tata Sky. She's been with MNCs like Shell, Coca-Cola, Parker Hanfin, Diversey, SEA Hygiene. She's got a lot of domain experience in corporate finance, treasury, taxation systems, risk management, and in Voltas, she heads the internal audit function. She's a mentor and coach and has conducted training for finance and non-finance personnel in basics of finance, corporate planning, code of ethics, etc. She's extremely passionate about internal audit ethics and corporate governance. So, and interestingly, she's actually spent a good amount of time in both finance as well as internal audit. So we thought we'll have her join us today. As the next panelist, we have Mr. Sunil Kumar. Sunil Kumar is the center head of the Global Center of World Bank Group in Chennai. He's responsible for providing the overall strategic leadership to the office. As a center head, he has played a pivotal role in transformation of the center from an accounting hub to a center that delivers a wide spectrum of business process services, including finance and accounting, HR, IT, knowledge management, and many other processes. He's a chartered accountant with over 30 years of experience in financial and shared services domain. Before joining the World Bank Group, he worked in American Express Financial Center at Delhi. And he also has good experience in manufacturing center from his previous stints at Ranbaxy, Intercraft, and Saraswati Industrial Syndicate. So he comes with a lot of experience, and we thought we will have his insights as well for this session. And last but not the least in any way, I think Mr. MP Vijayakumar needs no introduction. I think you all have met him yesterday itself briefly. But I still take the privilege and honor of introducing him. Of course, he's a chartered accountant, cost accountant, and company secretary. And he also serves as the chief financial officer of Sify Technologies since 2007. He's also an independent director and chairman of the audit committee at LIC. And he's also an independent director on the board of Geojet Financial Services and Heritage Foods Limited. He's also a member of the IFRS Interpretation Committee on International Accounting Standards Board. He's also served as a council member for the ICAI and was chairman of the Accounting Standards Board. So I think the list goes on, and I don't want to spend too much more time in introducing Mr. MPV to all of you whom you know well. So we'll get started on the topic. I'll just request the audiovisual people to actually put the slide, please. Three lines model. If you can go to the next slide, please. So all of you will be aware about the three lines model, and this is not something new to you. You'd have heard the term three lines of defense several times in the past. And one important thing to note is that sometime I think in 1999, 2000, IAA Global has revised the model. It was no longer called three lines of defense. It's called the three lines model. There are some, I would say, specific or intricate changes that they've made to the model. But today we'll be, for the purpose of our panel, we'll be focusing on the new revised model, which is called three lines. And this infographic that you see out here, it gives you a snapshot of the three lines model. Please go back to the infographic, please. Yeah, please keep this slide on throughout the session. So you have on the various key roles in this model, which is the governing body. You have the management which plays the first line role as well as the second line role, and internal audit, and which plays the third line role. And the accountability, responsibility relationships also are shown here. So I would probably, at this point of time, I think most, especially in the Indian context, you all agree with me that the Companies Act makes it mandatory for companies over a certain threshold to have mandatory internal audits. So unlike the global context where in many other countries, internal audit is still, the third line is actually an option in many cases. Largely in the Indian context, there is I would say, a need for a strong third line. And in that context, okay, and there is a lot of, I would say, responsibility also cast. But how far is this really, practically happening in companies? What is the views? And we have really eminent panelists here with us. So I'll probably start by asking each of them to share their views on the topic for about 5 minutes each. And then we can probably move on to the questions. Since you already heard Mr. Vijayakumar yesterday in another context, I'll probably request Ms. Vijayalakshmi to share her views first, and then we'll go ahead with Ms. Sunil. So Vijayalakshmi, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. One of the main differences between the three lines model that has been there since 2013, formally pronounced by the IIA Global, and from 2000 prior to that. So we already have seen and understood the three lines of defense. And the main thing that, as all of you would have noticed, is the elimination of the word defense. The earlier model was felt that it was too defensive, so that the organization has to constantly defend against risk, and the role is more of a defendant's role. Whereas today the business models are changing so fast, the risk landscape is not the same today as it was yesterday. And given this backdrop, we should not be only seen as defensive and doing a defensive kind of work, but we should actually be more proactive, identify the emerging risk. So that is going to be the key focus. Risk and governance should be the key focus. And I think with that background, the new three lines model was formulated by IIA. Just to quote Mr. Richard Chambers, he has beautifully put that the original model was so rigid that the distinction between the three lines were more hardened like silos. So all of us know, the first line of defense, the second line of defense, and the third line of defense. And people operated in their respective silos. And what was essential for the organization's success in achieving its objectives, which should be cooperation, communication, coordination. So that was completely missing over a period of time. And we also found that internal audit was actually reluctant to assist management in some of the implementation of corporate governance and control framework. So, and it's very important that all the three roles, the governing body, the management, and internal audit, work together and in sync. The other thing that I found interesting in this new model is that the governing body has been clearly defined, identified, and articulated, which was missing in the earlier models. The second key change that I noticed between the two was the more detailing that has gone into the new model. So it is not only describing what internal audit the third line would do or the second line would do, but it also describes how it would be done and what would be the checks and balances. So in that sense, it's very comprehensive, and it clearly articulates the need for transparency, the need for communication and collaboration, because unless that is there, it's difficult to achieve success. So that's the view.
Thank you very much, Vijayalakshmi. I think, Sunil, I think you are, obviously in your role, you oversee a very large portion of the World Bank's operations in India especially. And that comes with a lot of responsibilities as well as, authority as well as accountability in many different ways. So we just want to take your views as well. How do you see this kind of three lines actually work in corporate India?
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor and pleasure to be here talking about three lines. And as you may know, that three lines originated late in 1990s and early 2000 in the financial services industry. Then it got applied to all kinds of industry. The degree of application, the robustness of three lines will vary from industry to industry depending upon the strength of regulatory pressure that you go through. I can tell you that three lines are symbolic to describe the roles, but what is more important is the role of each and every line. But first, let's understand why three lines came into existence. And all of us are risk professionals here. Like, we have, when we started looking at the global businesses, we have come across, identified few risks. And the risks inventory gone on and on. Enormous risk. Whatever you identify the risks, now other risks will also come into existence, because we can never imagine what are the potential risks that an enterprise can face. We have financial risk, reputational risk, operational risk, fiduciary risk, and there are many, many risks. Now, to give you a context, the previous speaker was talking about the large picture in terms of the numbers. So why, 3 lines in the first place? Look at the ransom cybersecurity attacks which come. Let's look at the cost of those risks, and that will help us determine why these 3 lines are important. To give you the context, in terms of the ransomware, 46% of the companies have faced at least one ransomware attack. And it is expensive. When you are attacked by ransomware, a downtime for the organization is 23 days. Imagine, the organization is down for 23 days. Look at the cost. About 80% of the attack, 80% of the victims will have to kind of pay something to the attackers. And the cost of payment, average cost of payment is about $300,000. And average cost of what you call ransomware attack for an organization is about $5 million. So if this is the larger context and picture, you can see that the cost of doing business is becoming very expensive, and therefore it's very imperative for the companies to have these first, second, and third line of defense. You all know about the definitions, and we implement in our organization 3 lines of defense. I must tell you that we have a global center here in Chennai, which is started in 2001 and now going very strong. It's a strategic center outside of headquarters, largest center outside of headquarters. But we don't have third line of defense. The reason? Because of independence. Because we want third line of defense situated somewhere else, which is in Washington headquarters. But one more line of defense I want to talk about, which I'm sure you would have talked about in the session. We have 1.5 line as well. And the 1.5 is, the first line is where the process business functions are responsible to own and manage risks. Then the second line is that we call concept called DOC, which is you give direction, oversight, and you challenge the framework. So that's called DOC. But in between, there is a one line, which is the risk and control function, which could be embedded in the first line itself, but they are separate from the first line. So that is where, the corporations have started looking at 1.5. We do in the bank in terms of 1.5 lines also. So I will stop here. I'm sure there'll be, future opportunities like in this session.
No, very interesting,
Yeah.
Sunil. I think the 1.5 line, actually, if you read the position paper given by AA also, they clearly lay out right in the beginning that this 3 lines model has to be tuned to the organization's context. So coming from a financial services, coming from a very large, I would say geographically spread sort of a thing, I think very interesting to note that you have this 1.5 line also, and that's really good. And one more point that Sunil actually mentioned really resonates. He talked about how the third line is independent. They don't have it here. They don't have it in the location. They have it from a different location. And in the position paper, actually it says that one of the key things about the third line is independence. It's most important that that function is independent. So really good notes there. And so probably at this point of time, I'll also take Mr. Vijayakumar's views on the overall topic before we actually probably get in. I have a number of questions for Mr. Vijayalakshmi also, but overall very quick comments from your side, sir. Yeah.
Thanks, Krishna. As a quick comment, let me try to synchronize with what I mentioned in yesterday morning as part of the inaugural session. And it sort of syncs with this transition from the 3 lines of defense model to the 3 lines model. If you recall yesterday when we discussed about digital resilience, the term resilience independently, people connect it with are you able to absorb the shock? How good you are at absorbing the shock? So it's used largely in that context. But the term digital resilience, when we talk about a company like ours who is in the digital infrastructure space, digital transformation space, for us, digital resilience is all about how good an organization is able to grow with the opportunities arising out of the digital and is able to handle the challenges of the digital. on exactly similar lines. If you look at these 3 lines as well, and audit per se, the focus erstwhile, when you use the word 3-line defense, it was about how do I minimize risk, how do I avoid risk. So when you use the word defense, it's like trying to avoid a risk, trying to minimize the risk. So that's the context you get when you have the expression defense. So it is for this criticism that this word defense has been removed from the 3 lines of defense, and now we call it as a 3 lines model, because audit and management, whether it is 3rd line, which is internal audit, or management, the entire focus is to accept the reality that there's a risk, and how do I thrive doing business with that particular risk which is existing. It's not about trying to avoid a risk and look at a safer path. That is not business. Business is all about inherently, by definition, it is taking risk. So risk is inherent. So the question of this 3 lines model now is, how do I live with that risk? How do I live with that risk and thrive with that risk? So that's how that expression defense has gone out. So when as management, when you're looking at the first line and you're trying to put up your own operational kind of controls, the focus is this risk exists, but how do I still do it? Compliance, the risk of non-compliance exists, 2nd level, but how do I manage that? And then the 3rd line where we try to get an independent assurance. So that's the context of why that word defense is gone. Don't get me wrong, but more often than not, at least in private conversations, the impression I generally get is, when you look at internal audit, the impression which I generally get is, why do you take a risk? Why don't you avoid a risk? Look at the safer one. That conversation will never be acceptable for business. So this shift from 3 lines defense to 3 lines model is a strong reminder to all of us that risk will exist. We are doing business knowing fully well that there is risk. Question is, how do you thrive in that environment where risk exists? So that's all about this 3 lines model.
Excellent. I think there are upside to the risk, which is very important, and that's what the model has really brought out. And also the fact that end of the day, it's achievement of the organizational objectives. But one thing that Mr. Vijayakumar mentioned is still very, this thing, he said how management perceives, in the 3rd line, or how management perceives internal audit. On that topic, I was actually thinking about inviting Mrs. Vijayalakshmi's views, because she's been in finance for quite a while, and then she's also made that shift to internal audit, and she's running the mandate for a large company, and which is very diverse. They're into multiple types of products, and maybe she'll be better positioned to elaborate on those lines of businesses, but very diverse lines of businesses. So what is the perception shift that you saw in both yourself as well as your colleagues when you made that shift, as well as for the function? Because when you actually move from maybe a 2nd line to 3rd line, and in some cases maybe even bordering on 1st line function, what kind of a shift did you find in your own thinking? 2.5.
Like 2.5 men. Thank you, Krishna. That's a very interesting topic and pretty close to my heart. Just like MPV sir said a few minutes ago, risk and opportunity are 2 sides of the same coin. Likewise, I would say the CIA and the CFO are 2 sides of the same coin. The approach or the way of functioning cannot be very different. To me, agility is a very key factor. So a CFO has to be 100% agile in terms of his decision making and in grabbing opportunities to grow business and value to stakeholders. Likewise, internal auditors, agility comes in terms of identifying the emerging risk. So you can't be lax or slow in terms of looking at my past year's risks and how I will manage that. You need to be forward looking and futuristic. So in that sense, speed and agility. In fact, I can recall Mr. Richard Chambers, he would say, auditing at the speed of risk. So if risk moves, audit has to move as fast. So that's a common theme that I would say that runs across. The second thing is, I would say, business focus for the CIA and probably a risk focus for the CFO. So while we say that as a CFO, I have spent in large organizations, and what I would say is the CFO has got a problem-solving role and a business-growing role. The internal auditor is also no different from that. What we can bring to the table is, as an internal auditor, now I find that there is a lot more deep dive into activities. From a 30,000 feet view, you come to a ground level view and you understand what's happening. The second aspect is to delve a little deeper and look at the root cause for most aspects and most activities that are happening in the organization, including issues that the internal audit brings up. So it's not just to say what is the issue, but you apply the 5 whys. And then you will identify the root cause and come out with a solution, and you need to do it fast. So these are some of the aspects which the CIA can learn from the CFO, the CFO can learn from the CIA, and it's only a good collaboration between the two functions that will lead to the success of the company as a whole.
Yeah, and in fact, when as each of the panelists are speaking, I can really see various elements of that model unravel. If you see the third column, right, it says the third line has to play both an assurance as well as an advisory role, and that's precisely what Ms. Vijayalakshmi was talking about. That the assurance part is, obviously we have to plan our work to actually provide assurance on the various internal controls and various things that happen. But also, how can we be a business advisor to make sure that we are able to stay ahead of the risk? And while positionally, obviously, our Institute of Internal Auditors have taken the right call in saying that risk management is a different function. So this risk management typically falls in the second line. Your internal audit function is an independent objective function, but that does not mean that we should put blinders on and stay. We should actually be agile and see what emerging risks are there. So really, I can see that message really unfolding. And probably I'll just stay with you for another question is that, well, all this model sounds great. I think, in fact, India, in my perspective, I think is ahead of the rest of the world in many ways, that having mandatory internal audit for certain classes of company, all that is really good. But the real challenge really comes in is how is it empowered, how is it resourced, okay? And as you move from, finance function and being a CFO into, and where you were taking calls as to how do I need to spend this money on the third line? Do I need to allocate this money for internal audit? And that's probably the thought process would have been there. But today you're in a situation where, from an audit function, do we have adequate resources to deliver the mandate, to provide that value? So what are your thoughts on that and views on that? How do you deal with that situation?
Yeah, so one of the key aspects of this 3-line model is that the governing body has to give adequate resource and independence to the internal audit function. So I'll just give a practical example. We identified one issue in internal audit, that the company was not an authorized economic operator of the customs. So just to give a background, the customs department, they identify importers. You can register as an authorized AEO, and that would mean that you can clear your goods without paying customs duty and pay it after 15 days. For a company like Voltas, it was a huge saving in terms of interest cost. And the company was struggling for the last 18 months, and audit brought up the issue that yes, a company has not got the required registration. So this was the audit issue. But what I did thereafter was to discuss it across the stakeholder and identify why we were struggling with this matter. So I spoke to the legal team that was handling the registration, and incidentally, fortunately for the company, I also knew the partner of the law firm that was handling our case. So what I found was you had tons of data to be given. And Voltas is a very diverse organization. What we know about the company, you would have seen our ACs, we are the market leaders in the air conditioners. But we also have a very large project business in India. We also have a large project business overseas. Then we have a couple of agency businesses in textile machinery and mining and construction equipment. And each of these businesses are as diverse as chalk and cheese. But when you make the application to customs, it has to be a single application with all the data for the company given. And legal was at sea as to how I could do it. But internal audit is fortunate that this is the only function that has a ringside 360 view of the entire organization. So I could actually find out where there were difficulties and what were the challenges, and could actually move through the functions to get it sorted out. And eventually we got this whole thing done in 4 months. And being a Tata Group company, we did it, the entire process was ethically handled. So this is just to show as an example that as an auditor, if you stop yourself at just highlighting the audit issue and saying that this is a critical issue and I will take it to the board audit committee, you may not be respected much in the organization. At the same time, you also have a role to see if you can provide a solution. And this does not in any way dilute the independence of the internal audit department. So wherever you can be a solution provider, you must be. Right. And that's a key factor. So now once you earn your seat on the table, we actually become partners with the CFO. So for instance, recently when we transitioned from a large logistics service provider to another one, Pan-India, so the CFO had requested internal audit to go through the final settlement process and the documents and to do a pre-audit of that. So when large commercial agreements come to be signed, they take the view of internal audit on that, which may not happen in many organizations. So if you bring value to the table, I'm sure the organization would take it into consideration. And we must be aware and conscious of the fact that we are not diluting our position in any manner.
So I'll play devil's advocate there, okay? I mean, bringing value to the function, to the organization, yes, can be done, but it comes at a cost, and it comes at certain resources, right? You need time, all of you need more hours in your team, all of you need more tools. There's so many things that you need to deliver that value, because we've heard this statement, deliver value, okay? Internal auditor should deliver value. So probably between you and Mr. Vijayakumar, he's also a CFO, okay, and you've been a CFO. So I just want to understand, what would be your thinking process when you decide how much of your annual budget you want to allocate to internal audit? I know I'm putting you on a spot here, but just to get a sense of what would be your approach towards planning a certain allocation for the third line.
No, see, there are certain things I believe are part of cost of doing business, whether it is IT security or an assurance function, they're cost of doing business. So I don't think, at least my experience of large organizations, they have never decided on either the need of audit or quality of audit based on the cost consideration of how much budget needs to be allocated. At least that's not my experience. If you take the smaller organizations, probably it is true because their resources are genuinely constrained. But I think we need to recognize the fact that when you come to smaller organizations, and I talk about small organizations like 50 crore turnover, 100 crore, which in Indian context is mandatory. If you look at those organizations, they're largely proprietary driven. And in a proprietary driven organization, there are ways and mechanisms in which the audit or the oversight function on control, the proprietor has ensured that it is sitting inside that line 1 itself, sitting inside that line 2. He does that. So I think we need to separate the smaller organizations where internal audit is mandatory and hence it looks more like a checkbox kind of a thing. And the other relatively large organizations where there are independent boards and managements who are looking for assurance. In those organizations, I have not seen organizations getting constrained by cost as an issue. Maybe quality, obviously they keep shopping around, but I don't think cost has been a serious issue.
Sure, good point. I think the fact that gives a lot of comfort that, hey, we can ask for a larger budget, we can ask for more resources, provided we're able to deliver the goods. I think that's the message that has clearly come out. And so I have another question for Ms. Sunil. And in terms of, Ms. Vijayalakshmi just brought up that point very beautifully, that each of these functions cannot work in silos. Okay? And there's a risk of these functions working in silos and going in separate directions. And so in your, especially in your context, where you have the third line coming in from a different location, and all that, what is the level of, may not specific to your organization, but generally, what would be the kind of alignment that is today happening, and what should be the ideal situation, so that end of the day the three lines work together for the organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a journey actually. because it depends upon how much accountability an organization puts on each one of these lines. Because as I said, first line, own and manage risks. Second line, provide direction, oversight, and compliance, which is basically you challenge the framework. And the third line is independent. Now, all these three lines, especially the first and second, they have to collaborate with each other. To give you an example, like you talked about digital resilience. Nowadays, there are so many projects on the digital side which keeps going. Now, if the first line, who is responsible for designing their business function, who gives the business requirements for the project, who basically does the UAT testing, who makes the calls. Now, they might think that, okay, they are independent. They can assume the role of second line, but how they can be distinct and also at the same time still collaborate, it depends upon how do you set the tone from the top and how do you put the accountability under each of the lines. So if something goes wrong in the first line, the organization accountability is that, okay, you are responsible. Second is the second defense, which is basically there will be some accountability there also. But first line cannot say that, okay, the second line gives me framework, I followed and I messed it up. So that all depends on the accountability that you put in. Now on the projects, so what we do as a part of our institution is that huge amount of collaboration, because we use each other as a resource, institutional resource. Because if the accountability on the first line, it's important that I use second line and third line as a resource. And therefore, it is so important that we collaborate with each other. If any project is conceived, automation project, digital resilience, etc. So what we do, before even the business requirement document is finalized, it is also seen by 1.5 line, so that they can also opine on it. And the second line, which is the overall framework, within which the tolerances, appetites, etc. So the 1.5 line looks at whether it conforms to the framework which is there. So in this way, like for example, IT delivers on those projects. They are responsible for putting in the technologies. They know which technology works best. They are the project managers. So they assume the second line role at that point in time. So business and both collaborate with each other. I don't think that we are independent in any way. The collaboration is the key to success, and without collaboration, then we are exposing ourselves to the more risks.
It's a very good point about.
Krishna, can I just ask one question to him? Now, what's your experience in your organization of the collaboration between the first and second and the third line?
So it looks like I'm not doing a good enough job. So
No,
my role, but
I was curious actually, because I just wanted to, I was very curious. The first and second is perfect. I think that 1.5, it's what we see on the ground. And between the first and second line on one side and the third line. So what's the kind of experience here?
So very good. As I said, we use.
Because I'll give you one preamble.
Yeah.
I have one multinational company where I'm there, where it has to be independent, means completely independent. Like the example which Vijayalakshmi gave on pre-audit, the collaboration, it's a strict no. It's a strict no. So I just wanted to know how it is in your case.
Absolutely. I think, our third line is perfectly independent. Absolutely, there's no influence. But, as I said, that we use this as a resource. Now, if there is an internal audit program and they come and do the internal audit, I'm so happy that there is an internal audit process going on, because one is that it's assurance on my business that I'm responsible for, that whatever the framework that we have put in place is attested. And the second is that I'm also looking at from future point of view that there is something, because I'm responsible as a first line, and therefore if I'm missing on some picture, some part of my risk element that I'm missing on, the third line can tell me that, okay, this is the the problem statement that we need to address. The fourth is that if I'm not able to, in a large institution, if I'm not able to do certain things at my level, so I can also tell my problem statement to the third line, saying that this is my problem, help me out. So they can also write in their comments based on their independent view. And so therefore you can see that how the collaboration is happening across. But having said that, the 3 lines to be successful, first and foremost, I keep saying that accountability has to be very clear and it has to be owned. Without which collaboration is not going to happen, because otherwise we're going to work in silos.
Excellent point. I think in a large, well-organized, well-structured environment where the 3 lines are clearly defined, accountability, responsibility is very clearly assigned, the quality of people at various levels who are operating and working on those functions within those lines are of very high caliber. It's a very good example where is in a situation where collaboration can really do wonders to meet the objectives. But I think in today's context, in India's context, this is a very good prime benchmark example that we can keep. But there are also a lot of companies where it's not that clear, and a lot of it is gray. The lines are actually probably dotted lines in many ways, which are separating those lines, and in that situation, it becomes a lot more challenging. And I have 2-3 questions, but I'll probably put that in some order, and I'll invite each of you to just share your views. For companies where the lines are not really fully defined, what would be some good practices to actually ensure that these are very well established, understood by people? The reason I ask that is because it's very, I'm going to mix my second question also right now, but the reason is that it's all great when things are fine, but the moment a fraud hits, then everybody's first question is, of course they'll ask other people, first line, second line, everything, but what did the internal auditor do? What was the scope? What did he do? What did he not do? They'll ask this question. Very often, the internal auditor would have reported many things, many vulnerabilities and all that. But the accountability to act on those observations or not act on the observations, the ability to act on those observations, not observations, is with the other lines very often. So there's a lot of, I would say, dependency in this whole context. So unfortunately, the most replaceable person in this whole equation, because it's very difficult to go and replace a first line or a second line and all of that. It's very easy to replace an internal audit. It's easier to replace, because you do some other audits or something else, or you bring in another team, etc. So I want all your views. How do we bring in more clarity? How do we bring in more accountability to this entire 3 lines model? How do we get a lot more, I would say, buy-in to the fact that internal audit is independent? It has to be resourced effectively. It has to be a role where the ownership for implementation of some of these things has to be also with the respective line functions and other things. How do you go about that? Your advice from your various experiences. Yeah, anyone, any order. Yeah, please go.
Yeah, that's a very important question, Krishna. In fact, I would like to go back a step. So when you say that the roles and responsibilities are not clear, the lines are blurred or there are dotted lines, you would immediately need to look at the governing body, which is the board of directors of the company. So the 3-line model clearly says that the governing body is responsible to all stakeholders. So it's not just to management, it is to shareholders, to government, to the local authorities, to the, they have the ESG responsibility. So it's the entire board of governors that is responsible for this. And to do that, they have to act in a manner of integrity, transparency and leadership, which is again defined in the model. So when we say that what is the governance framework, and you need a proper tool and framework and resource to do that, one needs to look at what kind of charters the board has. Do you have a board audit committee? Do you have a risk management committee? What is the charter of the board audit committee? What is the charter of the risk management committee? Does IA have a defined charter? So the IA charter will spell out what the internal audit team can do, what it cannot do, and what are the boundaries. So these are very important. Does the organization have an ERM framework? Does it have BCPDR? Nowadays we also have BRSR reporting that's become mandatory for large organizations. Does the organization have SOPs in place? Does it have an adequate delegation of authority? Are these documents, are these structures and frameworks in place? If this is not there, then resourcing and making the, giving strength to the internal audit, the second line or the third line defense will not be effective. So it will become effective only it's driven from the top. So that's a big prerequisite for this whole thing to be a success. So unless the board drives this through the management and through all the lines of defense, this will work successfully.
Yeah. So I will make 3 points here. One is that tone from the top in terms of setting the accountabilities for each of the lines. The second thing is that it's okay to fail. It's okay that something went wrong, but it is not okay that we don't learn lessons from there. So I think lessons learned is very important, which can hopefully kind of set aside the grayer areas which are there, which kind of led to this kind of break. The third is that in terms of resourcing for each of these, and it comes from the lessons learned, it comes from the priorities that we as an institution put together. And for example, at our center, it is beyond me in terms of the resourcing for each of these lines, because it's an institutional priority for us for the various reasons that I talked about in terms of the risk that we manage and that we are expected to manage, because the cost of risk is sometimes unlimited. And again, it's not that we have to manage everything. We can accept the risk also, but we need to be vigilant. We need to be cognizant in terms of what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And therefore, the decision making becomes very clear, and the lines of accountability becomes very clear.
Yeah.
So Krishna, see, if you look at these frameworks, they are actually applicable for large organizations, organizations where risks are fairly high. And I think when you look at these, you should not confuse ourselves with many of us as internal audit practitioners, where we do audits, internal audits for organizations because of Companies Act requirement, a 50 crore turnover, 100 crore turnover. I think that distinction is extremely important. I don't think we should ever try to form our views on the relevance of this model based on that experience. I'd like to put that caveat up front. So if you were to take a large organization, my view between the third line and first and second on the other line, gray is intolerable. I don't think there should be any shade of gray at all there. I think it should be very clear that the internal audit function should be very, very independent. And the responsibility of its independence, the responsibility of its resourcing should be taken up at the board, and it's the board responsibility to ensure that the observations of the internal audit are acted upon by the management. I think if there is an element of gray which is there between first and second on one side and third, I think that organization is taking a substantial risk of, and it's preparing itself for failure. It's a matter of time. Now between the first and second, I think it's an organizational choice of how we want to, how much of independence you want to keep or separation you want to keep between first and second. As Sunil rightly mentioned, there are many cases of 1.5. Those are all depending on the respective organization's delivery, their own business models, part of it. So just on a summary to close on this, I think a strong message all of us need to take is, when it comes to internal audit function, zero tolerance for a gray to be there between these two. In fact, Vijayalakshmi, don't get me wrong, but I would actually be very hesitant to take responsibility of a pre-audit responsibility when I'm also, pre-audit I would take it actually as part of the second line at best. I wouldn't take it responsibility in the IA function. I would be very, very skeptical, because it is typically a management technique of pulling the internal audit into the whole scheme of things. That's how I would actually see that. While it's good to draw upon the expertise of the internal audit, because the control, their ability to see is quite different. But I would actually be very, very skeptical, because this is an independent function. I would let the management to do what it does, and I would like to sit on judgment on what it has been done. In fact, the arrow between the first and second on one side and third on the other side is that collaboration or communication or alignment is basically regarding the flow of information and common thinking towards the organization objective. That's how I understand that actually.
Yeah, if you will just allow me to clarify. So in terms of pre-audit, so this is I would say once in a year or once in 2 year kind of an event. So one time where we change from a logistic partner nationally, so the management's view was, instead of coming after 6 months and doing an internal audit on that, why don't you do a pre-audit and save the company some money and make sure that you have not missed out anything.
So one of it's fine.
So that,
there's many young professionals, I didn't want them to carry that message.
No. We do not give consulting. It's not at all. And there's a strict and irrespective of what kind of advice we give to management or any kind of consulting that we do, the audit program delivery is absolutely clear, and there will be zero compromise on that. So that's one thing. Yeah.
I think one of my key takeaways from the discussion so far in the last couple of minutes is that
Sorry for being candid, Sorry.
No, fine, sir. That's good.
The point that was made, that we cannot, gray is intolerable. We can't tolerate gray. Okay, which obviously means that as internal auditors, we need to be extremely proactive to make sure that that communication is understood. Of course, with certain certain types of organizations, it's not going to be easy. But it's very risky to accept a responsibility and not be able to deliver that. Okay, so I think it's extremely important to have a charter, even if we are an in-house internal audit team. It's extremely important to have a charter, get that approved by the right people who are in charge of the governance, and get that. I hope I've interpreted that very. And overall, if you look at the topic that we have for the day, which is digital resilience, I think today more and more organizations are getting to be processes are getting digitally enabled. There's a lot of RPA happening in most of the organizations. There are a lot of also, I would say, digitization. Manual records are today completely almost going away, and most places all scan records that people are actually dealing with, or scan, or even more digital information, and all this. So in terms of being digitally resilient from the 3 lines, what role do you think that the 3 lines can play to ensuring that, ensuring is always a bad word, we don't use the word ensure, but what role can 3 lines play to help organizations be more digitally resilient? Yeah.
I can share some views on this. We have, we borrow from the markets. We have exotic products as a part of our borrowing, derivatives and other that we need to value, and which goes to the financial statements. And that valuation of those products becomes very critical. And we used to have many still, in terms of macros, Excel formulas, etc., etc. So while this is important also to kind of value those products where it is outside of the system, but what is also more important is that what is the framework, governance framework around those critical risk touch points where which goes as feed as a information value to the financial statements. And then we started looking at, okay, what's the valuation governance framework we can put? And there is a kind of, as a part of the governance framework, you start kind of looking at some other systems which can replace those Excel sheets or the macros, or there is a more robustness in the process where you can't kind of change by mistake also like any of the formulas, because otherwise it could have very significant impact on your financial statements. So we kind of, this is also one example of digital resilience where we put those checks and balances in place by collaborating with the first and second lines of defense. And the other example which I can give you is that you talked about robotics, digital workforce. And we had a great journey actually, in terms of digital workforce. So we, it is just to kind of, replace our repetitive principle-based tasks with the bots. But it is not that, we don't want our people to do those routine tasks. They get burned out otherwise. So they can kind of do more high-end work, more deeper level work into their functional areas. So as a part of that bot, when it has to come in terms of the digitization of those bots, the business units are basically writing their descriptions. In fact, they sometimes write the bot. We train them to write the specs, and then the 1.5 lines come into play. They look at whether we are meeting the requirements of internal control, and then the testing happens accordingly. So what I'm saying is that we cannot do away the second line or 1.5 line from the work that we do in the digital arena, because it's always important, because we tell our people in the front line that this is a resource that we have to use, and therefore it is important that we take the expertise from the people who have that kind of skills.
Right. I think all the three lines have a really important role to play in a RPA journey. Like Mr. Sunil mentioned, I think to make sure that the process at end of the day well governed. And I think quick words from yourself and Ms. Vijayalakshmi also before we open up for the audience for questions. Mr. Vijayakumar, I think your organization deals with a lot of digital data, right? And information sensitive things for the clients also. So what kind of role do you see the three lines play in that kind of a context, or any digital journey for most companies? Yeah.
No, organizations which are using lots of data, of course Sify technology doesn't use much except that we are custodians of data which is hosted here. But in the other organizations where I engaged, there's a lot of customer related data which is residing. And all of those obviously can be addressed in today's context only with extensive use of IT. I think given the fact that we are sitting amongst the community of internal auditors, I think what becomes more critical now is the internal auditors' ability to understand IT security risks, because more often than not, the general complacency is that anything which comes out of IT is generally reliable. I think it's true most of the times until that failure happens, whether it is 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 100, but that failure risk remains. So I think the need for the internal audit community to be very conscious about the hundreds of applications which are running in the organization and the wide variety of digital infrastructure which is used, to understand that IT security and still give that assurance. Second is going back to that same three lines model picture. It's a beautiful picture which I like. And I think you highlighted in the case of the internal auditor, there is both the assurance responsibility as well as the advice responsibility. Advice responsibility comes from the wider exposure which you have. So as an internal auditor, I have experience of seeing 5 businesses, 10 businesses, different organizations. So my ability to share that experience to see how that organization can be more resilient. I think that would be the role for the internal auditors in the context of the IT era. So that's my thought on that.
Yeah, just to add here, it's not really easy, I would say. So moving on from the start point of access controls and moving on to process controls and then process automations. For example, in our company, we run our financials on the SAP system, and we also have a CRM system. For instance, any of you who have a Voltas air conditioner in your home and you need to have an installation service or a preventive maintenance or a repair service. So we have a comprehensive CRM system in Siebel. So what we found, and this is entirely delivered through our franchisee network across India with thousands of franchisees who also need to have access to the CRM system. So, so in our journey of digitalization, we developed apps which are on the mobile phones of the technicians, and they directly connect to our CRM system, and you get real-time information. So which is beautiful and is beneficial to the company. But at the same time, it also throws up a lot of applications which are disparate. And we also need to make sure that there is data integrity and how these applications are interconnected, and how as internal auditors do we audit these multiple systems. So it's really a challenge, and given the different nature of our businesses between the consumer facing business and the B2B business, harmonizing the various IT systems is also a challenge, and that is part of our digital journey today.
Excellent. I think my takeaway from the last question is also that in terms of today's digital context, it's not that this 3 lines model that you saw earlier, the infographic is not on the screen now, but the 3 lines model is actually extremely relevant even in today's context. In how do we superimpose that model to see what processes are getting digitized, what is the role of each of these lines in that digital journey with the new, digitally relevant risks which are actually also happening, and how each of these lines are going to play the function. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think we don't look at the IT technology as outside this picture, but it actually gets embedded in every line and every element of that overall journey. That's what I would think. And shall we open up the questions for the audience? So I think in the interest of time, maybe about 2 or 3 questions will be good. And please also name your whom you want the response by. But although we will probably take a call and get everyone to respond. Yeah. Any questions? And do you have microphones with you? It's a Saturday evening. I'm sure all of you want to head back as quickly as possible, but I don't think you'll get another chance like this to get such insights from so much of experience, wealth of experience, and knowledge and wisdom, importantly. So feel free to ask your questions.
Thanks a lot for the insightful session. My question is, more often the risk are regulatory by the regulators mandated. Say for example, the WorldCom and the Enron busted, and it led to in terms of SOX 404. And same way the financial crisis led in terms of your enterprise-wide stress testing capabilities and the recovery plans, the resolution capabilities, and the ransomware attacks enforced in terms of a need for information and cyber security. And more recently now, with the United Nations Development Goals, climate risk is kind of enforced. So we as the risk professional fraternity, both in sitting out in the second line and the third line, how are we kind of going to change our mindset in terms of going in for a foresight approach in terms of identifying the risks that are already existing in my business than in terms of a hindsight compliance?
So that's basically maturity of an organization and maturity of the overall ecosystem. In fact, if I were to take the same 20-year period which you mentioned, beginning from Enron to now, I think we need to understand that we are all maturing, when 2000 Enron and all happened, SOX came in, and many times these are reactionary. I think it's all about how we are maturing, and there are organizations in different stages. There's some organizations who have a lot of maturity, they have that management capability of foresight and are able to keep it as part of the risk management framework, address it in that second line, and third line gives that assurance. There are other organizations who are yet to mature. I think they will get there. So I see it more as a journey, and those I would say is distinction between the good and the great, So those who are developed that capabilities of foresight, that management has that capability, they dedicate the time towards that. I think they are the great organizations. The rest of us are good, we'll get there. That's my understanding. Yeah. He can add.
I totally agree with Mr. Vijayakumar. It is a journey. We may fall and we will learn from it. And again, I think one important thing is that nothing is cast in stone. Because once we become complacent that I have identified risks, yesterday, and I don't have to do anything now, that's the biggest myth, and that's a fallacy that we live with. Because I think we need to be agile enough, be aware of the surroundings, understand about the context in which we operate, what our competitors are doing, what are the pitfalls that we have, in the industry has, and learn from it and keep your systems, processes, and 3 lines agile to that.
classic example is climate risk, you know. We all knew it 10 years back, 20 years back. Time has to come for that. So now the time has come that people are very sensitive about that risk. You're putting more resources behind it. So it's a journey in my view.
Yeah, just to add to what both the eminent panelists have said, it's actually a journey, and one has to keep one's eyes and ears wide open. There is immense possibility of learning from, say, larger and more mature organizations within your industry, more mature organizations outside of the industry. There is so much to learn from. And you can also learn from good practices from MNCs across the globe. So it is what we need to, what we can and what we would like to learn and adopt from the other companies and other organizations. And finally, like we mentioned about climate risk, what was the biggest risk for Sony, for the Sony cameras? It's not another camera manufacturer, it was not Kodak, it was your mobile phone. You know, so you have to be aware of trends. You have to be very, very watchful and be understanding of what, I mean, we might not understand, we might not be able to even hazard a guess today, but definitely we need to be aware and keep our minds open. And that's where will take us further in our journey of risk management.
Yeah, and I think there are several sources of information. I'm not specifically on the risk, emerging risks, but I think when I go back to the point of how do we proactively communicate within each of our organizations about the 3 lines and all that. IA Global has done a wonderful job in collating all this knowledge material available in the I would say member section of the global website, and all of that can use that and to help learning and understanding within the respective organizations. Any other questions? Yeah.
One
Yes,
minute.
yes, please. Yeah.
Just
Can you pass on the mic?
hello.
Sorry. Yeah.
Hello. In the panel, Krishna sir asked one question, that is, when fraud happens, the internal auditor, the finger goes to the internal auditor. Like that, another question is there. I require the panel review also. One is, all the 3 lines are there, where whatever the business or the profession, they will ask only the bottom line. As an internal auditor, what you have done for the bottom line? Like that question will come. What will be the views of the pen?
When you say bottom line, you're talking about the profitability?
Yes.
Okay. So the value addition towards the bottom line of the company. Okay, bottom line. So then top line also is there.
All these 3 lines, I don't see this as a cost to the business. Of course, we have to quantify as a cost, but I think it ultimately adding to the top line or bottom line of the business, because, as you said, something wrong happens, what will happen? Hells will break loose. Reputational risk, the brand value of the institution, the products that you sell today. We have various examples. What happened? When these kind of question mark comes, then the brand value of the institution takes a big assist. You have seen, the latest news, you are kind of reading it. So what I'm saying is that I don't see this as a cost. I see this as a addition to the value or protecting the value of the institution through these lines.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think there are also very good tools and enablers, like called value scorecards. So each of those 3 lines, right? For example, the 3rd line can have a live scorecard, a value scorecard. This is the quantitative and qualitative benefits that internal audit has delivered through the year. Okay, and that scorecard will really help. It may not be exactly adding to the bottom line or doing that, but that's a really good value scorecard which will help communicate.
Krishna, if I may add here. So besides the internal audit delivery that we do, we also keep a scorecard and we value our services emanating out of our audit services into 4 buckets. So one, of course, we start with cost reduction, optimization of savings that we generate. The second would be the working capital improvements. Third would be process improvements that have emanated out of our audits. And finally, wherever we have strengthened compliance through our audit process. So we look at all 4 buckets, and we are conscious of the fact that we need to add value in all these areas as well. It will come out of the audit that we do. It will not come as a separate effort or an assignment, but it should be part and embedded as part of our audit services.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, please. Just pass on the mic, please. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, like, now the key term is circular economy. So, when we have better controls, the third line is strong. Do you see that third line and probably second line, do you see that the first line is able to take better risks? They're able to, you know, be more aggressive in taking the risks, knowing the fact that second and third line is more strong. Do you have any examples?
Yeah, shall I? Yeah, okay. You know, we talked about three lines working in tandem with each other. And one of the responsibility of the second line is to also disseminate the information, create awareness about the risks with the first line. So, you know, that is basically like, you know, if, to give you an example, you know, the cyber security teams that are there in the institutions today, you know, they kind of prevent, they have whole lot of systems, processes to prevent attack to their information assets or to their websites, or, you know, they kind of create awareness with people about malware, ransomware, phishing attacks. So that's where, you know, the kind of the awareness which happens with the first line. Because if that doesn't happen, then the gray area starts. What will happen? First line, you know, kind of makes a mistake, or if something fell through the cracks, and then the blame game starts. So in order for the three lines to be effective, it's important that it's not only in the boardroom meeting that we kind of look at the frameworks, but what this framework is all about. What is that institution is trying to get out of that framework, and who's responsible to do that is what I would say.
Right. It's not just that. I think at the risk of, you know, otherwise if they're going to put all the reliance on the third line and they're going to say, I'm going to take greater risks and all that, it can lead to a misaligned situation. And it can also be complacency on the first line. So I think it has to be a good balance of all three. You don't put all your investments at the third line and not have enough controls in your first and second line is my take on it. Any other questions? Yeah. So two parts to your question, sir. I think, yeah, two parts to your question. One is how do you ensure independence? Second part is how do you ensure that they're not contradicting to each other or they're not counterproductive, is your question.
I think best is going back to the picture actually.
AV team, can you put the picture back?
And
yeah.
You have that arrow between those two.
PPT.
I think it very clearly talks about alignment, communication and collaboration. I think those three, the board needs to ensure that interaction is happening. I think that's extremely critical. Now coming to the independence part of it, I think it's the board's responsibility to ensure that that function is pretty independent. In fact, a very strong view that as far as the internal audit is concerned, independence is paramount. And that's why when it came to the topic of grey, I said it has to be zero tolerance. So that is basic requirement. But having said that, it's all about state of mind also of the professionals who are working as part of that audit team. And I'll just use this opportunity to address her question, the previous one. My view, the first line controls or first line defense is first line is the most important one. The second and third are on top of it. So you never compromise the first line on the strength that I have the second and third. Never do that. Never attempt that.
So on the independence, you heard me saying that we don't have the third line in our center. And that too, third line in our organization reports to the topmost person, president of the World Bank. You know, that's the kind of independence we have. And the board, of course.
Any other questions? We're almost out of time, so we'll take probably one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for beautifully explaining the concept of 3 lines. Just one question. So by this model and concept, we understand that there should be a very clear roles and responsibilities between first, second and third line of defense. But sometimes we may see a situation where maybe responsibility is being done by the same team, as in maybe for an example, if I have to mention that maybe the internal controls testing and internal controls piece, if that is done by the internal audit team and then the internal audit of the same area. So how do you see that thing? Because the responsibility is not being clearly shared with the second line of defense and the third line of defense.
If I can clarify your question, you're saying the internal audit, internal control testing is being done by the internal audit.
Yeah, so my question is basically, how do you see how, is it the correct situation to be in, because internal controls testing is done by the internal audit team itself, and again when that audit is coming as a part of audit plan, so the same area is being tested in the internal controls testing and the same area is being audited by the same team. So the controls testing and the audit of same area is getting done by the same team. So how do you see that situation?
That is, so then we are compromising on the independence actually. You know, in this case, the internal audit is doing the internal control testing, then they're doing the audit of their own testing that they have performed. So independence is a big question mark here. Now to give you an example, what we do is that, we have a program called Internal Control of Financial Reporting. Okay, so basically we report our financial statements to SEC in the US. And therefore, there is a requirement that we should have ICFR program where we look at the key risks and controls in the overall processes. And then look at the 1.5 line comes into play then. You know, they become the second line now to look at those controls are effective, adequate, and report basically to management of any discrepancies. So that management, once they give their assertion on how the control, risks and controls are working, and that assertion is based on that. But that is not done by internal audit. Internal audit takes that into consideration, and external auditor also takes that into consideration when they give their audit opinion. But these are very clearly defined, separate from each other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just add to that is that I think your question in many companies, especially in across the globe, while some companies the ICFR testing is being done by a different team completely, in some companies the internal audit team is doing the ICFR testing, and you're looking at a conflict situation there. There are two things that I would like to add here is that one, if you're auditing the same area, then clearly your independence and objectivity is compromised. An area which you have performed, then IPPF standards will be in violation. The second part is that, however, when you're testing a control, you're not going to come back and rely on that testing. Okay, you're just testing a control and you're giving that output or information to management for them to make their CEO, CFO certifications. In that case, IAA India has come out with a guidance note ever since IFC came out. We authored a guidance note. In such situations, internal audit is playing a resourcing support for the respective functions. It's not that internal audit is providing the final conclusion on those controls. So it depends what is the role that internal audit has to play, so that you're able to, end of the day, on what basis does management take that CEO, CFO certification? It cannot be purely on the basis of the third line's work. So there is a guidance note. I would you can refer to that. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Sorry, you had a last question, and we can wind up with that. Yeah, so I think. Sure. So we can't hear you. Just 1 minute.
Advice. Third line advice. She has some question.
Okay. Yeah, the last question. Yeah,
This is regarding the advice which the internal audit gives, especially on the emerging risks, or could be the known risk already existing but not acted upon. How receptive are the first line and the second line in receiving the observations or the recommendations which the internal audit gives?
Yeah,
we have your experiences.
We have two CFOs in the team and management, so we'll probably ask.
Exactly, that's the reason I brought this up, because I do not want to miss on their experiences.
So I can share you example of our organization. Actually, we welcome that. When we ask our third line to give, to do an advisory, because they look at as an auditor. They look at, okay, what is the gap? Because we don't want them to come as an auditor and show us the gap. They give us advisory saying that this is the problem which can come up, and it's good for us to kind of take their advice. And it also depends upon the independence that we provide to this third line. If they are independent, they know that they are not subject to any influence, and they are looking at very objectively from their side. I think it's a welcome step where we take as an institutional resource and work on their advice. Because imagine, if we have not done that, we have suffered some losses, and that would have been a much greater cost to the institution. Or they come as an auditor and pointed out the audit anomalies, and that would be reported in my performance valuation also, right?
Okay.
In the first case, it's not.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to your answer, ma'am, it's sometimes a matter of timing. So if there is an issue or there's a risk, and the third line feels that it's important that the advice be given to the first and second line, instead of waiting, the same thing would be covered in the audit program maybe 3 or 6 months down the line. So we would not wait to do that, but instead we would proactively give advice to the first and second line so that the problem can be fixed. So sometimes it's just a matter of timing. And yes, this is very well received, and I would say, at least with a great degree of, I would say, truthfulness, that whatever advice we give, that doesn't ever compromise on the kind of audit reports and the kind of observations that we take to the audit committee and senior management. And just because our advice is given and taken doesn't mean that we will not give certain hard-hitting audit reports. We do that all the time.
So that's all we have time for. But before we close, because we got a direction from the IA India president that we should close the session. So I don't want to violate that. But before we close, any closing line, any closing comments from any the three panelists?
I think collaboration is the key across the three lines.
Independence of internal audit function.
I would echo that, sir.
I think we heard quite a bit from them. I think let's give them a very good hand. I think really grateful for all their insights and wisdom today.
Thank you, Krishna. Thank you, all the panelists. So I wanted to share one thing. I really wanted to attend at least this panel. I've never attended MPV sir's panel, which has been organized by our forum. I've always been busy. So probably I should invite him to another place to be a panelist so that I can be a guest delegate there and really listen to all that. So this time also I've missed that opportunity. I think all of you had a very good, excellent time. I have just quick 2 announcements. There is going to be a feedback form that will be displayed. Kindly do the feedback. We really value that, and we want to do more improvisations in our next conference. The next one is the Kluwer teammate has announced the lucky draw winner, Karthik Vijay Anand from Ashok Leyland. So Anand will be distributing the lucky draw prize to Vijay Karthik, the winner. Vijay Karthik, is he there? Yeah, please come. So we don't have a formal validity session. It's just a concluding remark. Once again, thank you all very much. It's been a very interesting 2-day event, and I'm really, really happy, and thank you very much, teammate. Thank you. Mr. Ram Kumar, our Secretary of IAA India, IAA Chennai chapter, to honor Mr. Vijayakumar. Mr. Vidyadran, to come and honor Mr. Sunil Kumar. Mr. Manoj Kumar, to honor our own BOG who did an excellent job moderation. So that's how the power of our IAA Chennai again. A big hippie hooray to IAA Madras chapter. But for them, we could not have done this event. So I thank all the BOGs of IAA Chennai chapter, the past presidents and the current president BOGs, and all the chairs of the committees.